Or as I mentioned, a little later this week, in fact on Wednesday, the PM will be in Adelaide and lock in the October 14 date for the Voice referendum. That's a 6.5-week campaign. Let's bring in the director of the Yes 23 campaign, Dean Parkin. Dean Parkin, thanks for joining me. How closely,
Good morning, Andrew.
How closely have you been coordinating this with the government, and what do you make of that working class suburb in Adelaide, Jimmy Barnes's old suburb, Elizabeth, being the place where the date's announced?
Look, we're really excited about the announcement this week. We've always said that the timing of the referendum, the announcement, was up to the government, was up to the PM. Our job has always been to make sure that the Yes campaign was ready to go when that announcement was made, and I can assure everybody out there that we have been campaigning very, very strongly over the last few months. We've now got more than 27,000 volunteers around the country, Andrew. These are people that aren't members of a political party or unionists or other campaigners. They're just Australians wanting to get behind the Yes vote. So having this announcement this week in Adelaide, it's an important city, it's an important state, as are many other states around the country. We're really excited about the date. I think it'll sharpen the minds of voters and reinforce to everybody that later on this year we'll be asked a very simple question to recognise Indigenous peoples as the first peoples of this country through a voice, and we're just really keen to get that starter's gun fired in terms of the actual time frame.
Now, you heard Jane Hume before, Liberal frontbencher, says it'll fail, says there's not enough, it's because there's not enough detail, and that it'll change the Constitution for the worse. What do you say to that?
Well, look, we know that there's about 40% of the voting population in this country that are absolutely undecided, haven't made their minds up. In many cases, people aren't even aware still that there's a referendum on, and that's understandable. We've seen on your program earlier today that there are a number of pressing issues facing Australians today, so it's understandable that this far out from the vote that some people haven't turned their mind to it. That's why the announcement this week is so important. When we're out there on the ground talking to people in communities. Yesterday I was at a number of markets in and around Sydney talking to people. There is a great deal of generosity and goodwill. It's very, very different to the kind of media-driven conversation, the political conversation. People understand the simplicity of what's being asked here, that it's the job of the Australian people to say, yes, there should be a voice. And it's a very simple concept. We're talking about a committee made up of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples advising parliaments and governments on issues that have a really important effect on our communities, issues like health, education, housing and jobs, because it doesn't matter which side of the debate you're on, Andrew, everybody agrees that the status quo for Indigenous peoples is not good enough. We can't just keep doing the same thing, and we know that we get better results when we listen to Indigenous peoples about how their communities work. So Australians get that, and I think there's a great appetite to make sure that there will be a successful yes vote come referendum day.
Dean Parkin, for Australians worried about the fact it's a permanent change to the Constitution in terms of this voice advisory body, what would you say to them to get their vote, to encourage them to vote yes?
Well, what we're doing in this actual referendum, the Australian people are saying, yes, there should be a voice. The actual constitutional change that has been developed has been rigorously tested. The overwhelming weight of legal opinion says it is the safest option that we have. The Australian people are effectively providing a guarantee for the voice, and that it is up to the parliament, this parliament, the next parliament, subsequent parliaments, to design the details. So we will get a voice after the successful referendum. The Parliament and Senator Hume and others across the benches, the government, the opposition, they will all have their say, as they should, about what the details of the voice should look like. And then in time, as we learn lessons about how the voice should work, we're able to amend it, we're able to improve it, we're able to make sure that it is utterly focused on what it should be doing, which is making sure that we're getting real practical change on those key issues for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. That's the only reason why we're doing this. We're doing this because we want to see real change. We want to see real improvement on those closing the gap measures. We want to see better use of taxpayer spend. We want to make sure that that investment is hitting the ground where it is needed most in Indigenous communities. So that's what the voice is about. We get to recognise Indigenous peoples. We get to do it through a voice. We get to do something practical. It's a very good deal for the country.
What do you make of this kerfuffle over what constitutes a yes or a no in terms of a tick or cross on the ballot paper?
Well, I think the Australian Electoral Commission has done this before. This isn't their first rodeo. They have done many elections. They've overseen referendums in this country in the past. I think we should trust that the AEC knows exactly what it's doing. We certainly, as the Yes campaign, we follow its advice rigorously. We follow its direction rigorously. That is what we are supposed to do. I think it has been a bit of a kerfuffle, but ultimately, as I say, the AEC, they know what they're doing. They've done this before, and I think Australians can have great confidence in our system and great confidence in knowing that when they cast their vote later on this year, it will be for something very good for our nation, something that can bring us together, and that's what we're just 100% focused on.
What can we expect over the next 6 or so weeks of this referendum campaign? Will you be spending up to $100 million in advertising?
Well, we are going to leave no stone unturned in our efforts to get out there and have the conversation with the Australian people. We'll be out there, as we have already, door-knocking tens of thousands of households across the country. We're getting tremendous feedback from that work. You'll see us in the Saturday market stalls. You'll see us at events across the country. I've always said that this is about taking the referendum to the people of Australia. So you can expect to see more Yes T-shirts in and around the streets, badges, people talking about this in their communities, because the referendum is all about Australians at the end of the day. It is about the Australian people. That is why we are determined to make this a people's movement. Of course, there'll be further messages on various different channels. We'll see some advertising as we get closer to the vote. But ultimately, it is about the millions of conversations that we want to have, that we want to be involved in around the country. Because as I say, when we do that, there is a great deal of openness, there's a great deal of generosity, and I'm very encouraged by what we're seeing and hearing from the ground. Absolutely.
Finally, what's the consequence if you lose? That's not what we're thinking about, Andrew. As the shirt says right now, we are focused on one thing and one thing only, and that is getting Australians to vote yes. It's not about talking about the consequences of what happens on the other side. It is about talking about the opportunity for our nation, about when we get this right. When Australians vote yes, very simply, in 2023, after 235 years of the modern Australian nation, we get to recognise Indigenous peoples very simply as the first peoples of this country in our constitution, and we get to do something very practical, very meaningful through the establishment of a voice. So I think Australians will see the opportunity at hand. They want to be part of this magnificent moment in our history. They want to be part of a moment that brings us together, and that's what we're hearing on the ground, and that's what we'll continue to work towards. Yes 23 Campaign Director Dean Parkin, thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thanks, Andrew.